The moment Greater Manchester Police raid a lockup as they execute an arrest warrant. In the heart of Greater Manchester, a gang of criminals were preparing for what they believed would be the perfect job. This wasn't a robbery or a drug deal, it was a kidnapping. Their target? A man they believed was a major underworld player sitting on cash and cocaine. Disguised as plainclothes police officers, they snatched him off the street in broad daylight and vanished. What followed was a 13-hour ordeal involving tasers, blowtorches, and a £500,000 ransom demand. The plan was ruthless and professional until it wasn't. One mistake, one call to the real police, and the entire operation began to unravel. 8 men, 1 victim, and a trail of brutality that led straight back to betrayal, greed, and the illusion of power. They thought they'd found the perfect mark. Instead, they exposed themselves. He wasn't just someone in the wrong place at the wrong time. The man at the center of this kidnap plot was, by all accounts, a known face in certain circles. Someone who lived on the edges of legality, skirting between business, reputation, and rumor. The gang didn't stumble across him by chance. He was selected and watched. They believed he had what they wanted: money, drugs, influence, and crucially, they believed he wouldn't dare go to the police. That assumption was based on more than just gossip. The victim's history painted a picture of someone with deep roots in the underworld. He'd been linked to drug operations before, had brushes with law enforcement, and was known to keep a low profile despite clearly living well. Expensive clothes, high-end cars, unregistered phones. It all pointed to someone earning big and keeping it quiet. The kind of person who handled things in-house, without outside interference. But what made him especially vulnerable was his routine. He had grown comfortable, perhaps even careless. He played weekly football matches, often with the same faces. He visited local restaurants without switching up his patterns. He returned to the same barber shop. These habits gave the gang exactly what they needed: predictability. Sean Freeman exploited that predictability. A long-time acquaintance of the victim, Freeman was a familiar and trusted face. No one would think twice about seeing the two together. He used that trust to gather information, slowly building a dossier. Vehicle registrations, addresses, names of relatives. He played the role perfectly. Friendly, loyal, just another lad in the circle. But all the while, he was feeding the gang everything they needed to strike. The victim may have sensed something was off. He moved like someone watching his back, never lingering too long, always alert. But when betrayal comes from inside your own circle, even the most streetwise can be caught off guard. In this case, it wasn't just the streets that betrayed him. It was someone he called a mate. April 11th, 2019. The day everything snapped into motion. After weeks of watching, planning, and laying the groundwork, the gang activated their plan. The target, unaware he'd been under close surveillance, had just left Snip's Barbers in Hale, fresh trim, relaxed, walking straight into a trap. Waiting for him were Daniel Lowe, Ben Ukaegbu, and John Bishop. They didn't need uniforms. The plainclothes look gave them just enough credibility. Confident, composed, and armed with fake authority, they told him he was being arrested on suspicion of Class A drug offences. He didn't argue. No shouting, no running. He'd been through arrests before, and this felt routine. Another stop, another case to deal with. They cuffed him and walked him over to a black Audi A6 parked nearby, its number plates cloned to avoid suspicion. To bystanders, it looked like a quiet, professional takedown, nothing dramatic, but what followed was anything but standard. Instead of heading to a police station, the Audi weaved through a series of back streets before coming to a halt in a quiet alley in Gorton. That's where the mask dropped, literally and figuratively. As the car stopped, Micah Walfall was already in position. The moment the victim stepped out, he was grabbed, a hood was yanked over his head, and the cold metal of a gun. An imitation, but close enough to be convincing, pressed into the side of his skull. There was no chance to protest, no time to process. Within seconds, he was bundled into a VW transporter parked nearby, and the Audi sped off. No sirens, no paperwork, just silence, confusion, and brute force. The van didn't have flashing lights or a custody cage. It had one purpose: transportation to a hidden site where the real ordeal would begin. Everything had been set up in advance. The vehicle was in place. The safe house was prepped. The route had been mapped and timed. The goal was to make it look seamless, to disorient him so quickly and completely that resistance felt pointless. And it worked. Within minutes, the victim had gone from casually leaving a barbershop to being a hostage in a van with no clue where he was being taken or what would come next. Inside the Gorton lockup, time stopped. The walls were bare, cold, industrial, nothing more than concrete and metal, echoing with every scream and demand. No windows, no natural light, no witnesses, just one man, bound and broken, surrounded by people who were convinced he was sitting on a gold mine. For the next 13 hours, his world collapsed into a haze of pain, fear, and confusion. The orders came quickly, barked out like they were routine. £100,000 in cash. Another £400,000 in cocaine and heroin. The gang didn't see this as a request. It was a transaction they expected to be completed. They were certain the victim had access to that kind of money. After all, in their minds, he was no ordinary target. They saw him as a well-connected player in the drug world, someone who could snap his fingers and have £500,000 in his lap by nightfall. But when he failed to deliver, things turned brutal. He was tasered repeatedly in the groin, the jolts of electricity deliberately targeted to maximize pain. His arm was burned with a blowtorch, skin blistering as he screamed through clenched teeth. They showed him a firearm, imitation but hyper-realistic, and pressed the barrel to his head. He didn't know it was fake. In that moment, it may as well have been the real thing. The threat wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Each act of violence was methodical, spaced between new ultimatums. You've got an hour, make the call, find the money, or it gets worse. And it did. The gang phoned his family using burner phones, disguising their voices, making the stakes clear. They demanded the ransom be delivered to Birmingham. No police, no stalling, just cash, and fast. For the victim's loved ones, the call was like being dropped into a nightmare. They didn't know if it was a bluff, a scam, or something more sinister, but the fear in that call was unmistakable. And instead of folding, they acted. Quietly, urgently. They called Greater Manchester Police. Back in the lockup, the air was thick with dread. The victim, bruised and semi-conscious, drifted in and out of lucidity. Every sound felt like a threat. The gang around him felt confident, almost relaxed. They believed they were in total control, convinced the victim's silence and the family's fear would buy them time. But what they hadn't accounted for was that help was already on the way. By the time Greater Manchester Police fully understood the scale of what they were dealing with, the victim had already endured hours of torture inside a locked, windowless unit in Gorton. But the gang had miscalculated. They thought fear would do the work for them. They assumed the victim's criminal background would silence his family, that no one would risk involving the authorities. But the opposite happened. The second the ransom demand was made, alarm bells rang. The victim's relatives didn't hesitate. They went straight to the police. That decision turned the tide. The call provided just enough to work with. It gave officers a voice, a general area, and a rough time frame. Every available unit was mobilized. Surveillance analysts dug through phone data. Tactical firearms teams were briefed and placed on standby. Hours later, armed officers closed in on the Gorton lockup. What they found inside was grim. The victim, barely responsive, was curled in a corner, burn marks down his arm, bruising to his torso, dried blood on his clothes, but he was still breathing. He was lucky to be alive. 2 men, Ben Ukaigbu and John Bishop, were arrested without resistance, not a word between them. No explanations, no panic, just cold silence. That silence told investigators everything they needed to know. The scene inside spoke volumes too. Forensics moved quickly, bagging evidence before word could spread. A balaclava found in a kit bag tested positive for Delroy Chin's DNA. It didn't stop there. A warrant was executed at Chin's address, where detectives found another vehicle tracker and a pair of handcuffs. Not exactly everyday household items. Micah Wallfall, the gang's enforcer and the man responsible for most of the physical violence, had already left the country. But his escape plan was sloppy. He fled to Spain, thinking he'd bought himself time. He hadn't. Detectives flagged his details with international partners, and within months, Wallfall was arrested abroad and flown back to the UK under escort. Meanwhile, the full story began to unfold. Sean Freeman, once a trusted friend of the victim, emerged as a central figure. He had saved the victim's number plate in his phone. He had compiled names of family members. He'd even shared a meal with him at Nando's, giving Chin the perfect opportunity to attach the tracker. Every action had been calculated, every move rehearsed. The arrests didn't slow. And with each new piece of evidence, the gang's web of secrecy started to unravel. Each member of the gang had a defined role, and together they formed a tight, calculated unit. Their actions weren't chaotic. They were deliberate, rehearsed, and rooted in experience. This wasn't a group of strangers thrown together overnight. These were individuals with criminal backgrounds, shared motives, and a willingness to cross any line for money. They operated like a crew with a plan, not a mob chasing impulse. Each move had been thought out. Each task assigned. Micah Wallfall was the muscle. He wasn't just present, he was central to the violence. It was Wallfall who delivered the most extreme parts of the assault. He used a taser to torture the victim, aimed a blowtorch at his arm, and held a realistic imitation firearm to his head. His job was to break the man mentally and physically, and he carried it out with disturbing precision. When police raided the lockup, Wallfall wasn't there. He'd already fled the country, escaping to Spain in the days that followed, but it wasn't a clean getaway. He was tracked down, arrested abroad, and extradited back to the UK to face justice. He received a sentence of 11 years and 3 months. Sean Freeman's role was less violent, but just as vital. He was the insider, the friendly face who turned. A trusted acquaintance of the victim, Freeman used regular contact to gain intel. They played football together, met socially. It was Freeman who recorded number plates, gathered the names of family members, and quietly observed routines. Most importantly, he was the one who lured the victim to the Pars Wood Centre in Didsbury under the guise of a casual meal. That meeting gave Delroy Chin the window he needed to attach the tracker to the car. For his betrayal, Freeman was sentenced to 9 years. Delroy Chin was the technician. He handled the surveillance side of the operation, fitting the tracker, managing movement, and staying embedded in the logistics. His DNA was later found on a balaclava recovered from the lockup, and a search of his home uncovered more evidence, a second tracker and a set of handcuffs. Chin was handed 11 years behind bars. Supporting the core team were 5 more men: Nicky Barnes, Daniel Lowe, Michael Ituhu, John Bishop, and Ben Ukegbu, each convicted for conspiracy to kidnap and blackmail. Their sentences ranged from 7 to 12 years. Ituhu, once a football agent, was described as the facilitator, a man with the contacts and calmness to keep the operation running smoothly. He was sentenced to 10 years and 2 months. In the courtroom, the scale and planning behind the operation left little room for sympathy. Judge Hilary Manley didn't mince words. She described the plot as a sophisticated, well-prepared criminal enterprise, meticulously arranged, ruthlessly executed. The gang's coordination may have impressed on paper, but the cruelty at its heart revealed everything about their true intent. Each member played a part in a scheme driven by greed and power. They believed the victim wouldn't speak, that his background would keep him silent, but they misjudged both him and his family. The moment ransom calls were made, the victim's relatives turned to the police, setting in motion a swift, multi-force investigation that would pull the gang's entire operation apart. Detective Sergeant Mark Evans spoke after sentencing, saying, "This was a lengthy investigation involving painstaking work by multiple teams, and today, every single one of these individuals is behind bars." The fallout rippled through Manchester's underworld. A message had been sent. No matter how calculated, no matter how bold, crime like this couldn't survive the weight of police pressure and determined victims. The gang's plan was brutal, but the response was methodical. And in the end, justice caught up with them, loudly, completely, and without mercy. The gang believed they had the perfect plan: target someone from their own world, someone unlikely to call the police, and use fear to squeeze £500,000 out of him. Every step was calculated. From the fake arrest to the choice of location, the tracking devices to the torture tools, they'd covered their bases. Or so they thought. But greed has a way of blinding even the most strategic minds. They overlooked one crucial factor. Desperation cuts both ways. While they were busy terrorizing the victim, his family was already speaking to police. Every call, every demand, every movement was pulling the noose tighter around them. What followed was one of the most intense investigations Greater Manchester Police had faced in recent years. Arrests across cities, extraditions from abroad. Every name on the list ticked off until there was no one left standing. This case wasn't about justice for an innocent man. It was about drawing the line, showing that no matter someone's background, no one deserves to be kidnapped, tortured, and used as leverage for profit. The gang may have believed their world operated by its own rules, but the law caught up. And in the end, every last one of them paid the price. It was just after 11 p.m. in the quiet East London suburb of Woodford Green, when 6 shots shattered the night. A man stood in his kitchen, unaware he was being watched from the darkness of his back garden. Moments later, 2 bullets tore through the glass, striking him in the neck and hand. The victim? Paul Allen, once a feared cage fighter, and more infamously, the right-hand man in Britain's biggest cash robbery. Now, bleeding out on the kitchen floor of a luxury home, Allen's past had come back with lethal intent. But this wasn't a random attack. It was the climax of a carefully orchestrated plan, involving surveillance, tracking devices, international burglaries, and a murder plot that spanned 2 countries. The men behind it? 3 seasoned criminals with a taste for high-stakes jobs and a determination to settle old scores. Their mission nearly succeeded. But in the years that followed, detectives would pick apart every move, every message, every mile driven. And what they uncovered was something far darker than a revenge hit. This is the story of how Daniel Kelly and the Ahern brothers almost pulled off the perfect execution, and how they lost everything in the process. To understand the motive behind the shooting, you first have to understand the man at the center of it all, Paul Allen. He wasn't just a name in the criminal underworld, he was a legend. In 2006, Allen played a central role in what remains Britain's largest cash robbery, the Securitas Depot heist in Tonbridge, Kent. The plan was cinematic in scale: armed men in masks, a manager's family kidnapped and held hostage, staff tied up at gunpoint, and over £54 million in cash packed into a 7-ton lorry and driven away under the cover of night. It was bold, violent, flawless, almost. The authorities caught up with Alan, and in 2009, he was sentenced to 18 years. But the money? Most of it was never recovered, and neither were the grudges. By 2019, Alan was a free man. He'd traded the shadows of the criminal world for a quieter life, or so it seemed. Now in his 40s, he was living with his partner and children in a luxury rented home in Woodford Green, East London. It was the kind of place that suggested new beginnings. Detached, respectable, tucked away from his past. But the past has a way of catching up. Alan had been the trusted lieutenant of Lee Lightning Murray, the infamous cage fighter turned mastermind of the Securitas job. Both were known for precision, for ruthlessness, and for a certain code among thieves. Yet in a world where loyalties are as fragile as freedom, it didn't take much to turn old alliances into targets. And that's what Alan had become, a target. Whether it was revenge, unfinished business, or an attempt to silence a man who knew too much, someone had decided his time was up. But this wouldn't be a street corner hit or a pub brawl. What was coming for Paul Allen had been planned, tracked, scoped. And when the bullets came through his kitchen window, they weren't just aimed at his body, they were aimed at everything he once represented. The men who came for Paul Allen weren't reckless or impulsive. They were cold, disciplined, and deeply embedded in organised crime. Daniel Kelly was a career criminal known for his reach beyond UK borders. Stuart and Louis Ahern, brothers from southeast London, had long been operating in the shadows. They didn't make moves without planning them first, and when they did, the stakes were usually high. Weeks before the shooting, the trio had already proven what they were capable of. In Switzerland, they orchestrated a high-value museum burglary that saw rare Ming Dynasty antiques disappear overnight. The execution was slick, the getaway clean, and the artifacts worth millions briefly vanished into the criminal underworld. Kelly and Louis even flew to Asia, trying to sell one of the stolen pieces through a legitimate auction house. It wasn't just about money, it was about reach, boldness, and believing they were untouchable. But by July 2019, their attention had shifted dramatically and violently back home. Paul Allen was now in their sights. The motive behind the hit remains murky. Was it personal? A score to settle from their shared past in the criminal world? Or was Allen, recently out of prison, seen as a threat, someone who knew too much or had talked to the wrong people? What's clear is how calculated the lead-up was. The men planted a GPS tracker on Alan's car, a black Mercedes, and synced it to an iPad. They didn't guess his movements, they studied them. Every trip, every stop, every return home was logged. When he was inside, when he was alone, how long he stayed out, all of it monitored in real time. That same iPad, later found at the bottom of the Thames, would become a silent witness in court, a digital roadmap to a planned assassination. This wasn't rage, it wasn't random, it was targeted. And what had started with stolen art and bold escapes was about to escalate into something far more permanent: murder. By the evening of July 11th, 2019, the plan was in motion. The Renault Captur, a seemingly ordinary hire car, had been secured 2 days earlier by Stuart Ahern. But this wasn't its first outing. Just the night before, it had been used in a burglary at a gated community in Sevenoaks, Kent. The gang had posed as police officers, fitted the vehicle with a blue flashing light, and broken into a luxury flat. Handbags, designer clothes, and cash were taken. Now, with the same car and a new target, their intentions were far more violent. That night, the trio left their home turf in Woolwich, southeast London, and crossed the city under the cover of darkness. Their route took them through the Blackwall Tunnel, cutting north towards Woodford Green. It was a calculated journey, one they'd made before during their surveillance runs. They knew exactly where to go. Stuart Ahern parked the car on Worcester Avenue, just behind the target's home. While he stayed behind the wheel, acting as lookout and getaway driver, Daniel Kelly and Louis Ahern slipped through a neighbouring garden. From this vantage point, they had a clear view of Paul Allen's back garden and, crucially, his kitchen. Just after 11:09 p.m, the silence shattered. 6 rounds were fired through the glass doors and windows, the sudden cracks tearing through the night like thunder. Allen had been standing in the kitchen. One bullet hit his hand, another tore into his neck and lodged near his spinal cord. He collapsed on the floor as his partner, Jade Bovington, screamed for help. Within seconds, Kelly and Lewis were gone, back through the garden, into the waiting car, and away into the darkness. Allen's life hung in the balance. Paramedics and police arrived within minutes. He was rushed into emergency surgery, where doctors managed to save his life. But the damage was irreversible. The bullet that struck his neck had severed his spinal cord. The once feared cage fighter, who'd helped pull off the biggest cash robbery in British history, was now paralyzed from the chest down. The gunman hadn't finished the job, but they'd changed a life forever. In the aftermath of the shooting, the scene was chaotic, but detectives knew time was critical. The Metropolitan Police cordoned off Malvern Drive and began their work. Forensics combed through the garden, the house, and the surrounding properties. Within hours, crucial clues began to emerge. 5 bullet casings were found, scattered near a summer house at the rear of the garden. Ballistics confirmed they came from a Glock SLP handgun, a model often favoured in organised crime due to its compact design and stopping power. Inside the house, another bullet had lodged in a doorframe, missing Allen by inches, but it was the swabs taken from a nearby fence panel that delivered the first major breakthrough. DNA recovered from that fence, just yards from the firing position, provided a match to both Daniel Kelly and Louis Ahern. A second major lead came when officers searched Kelly's address. Hidden among his belongings was a laser sight compatible with the Glock model used in the attack, an accessory often used to enhance accuracy in low light. It was damning. Meanwhile, investigators followed the trail of the hire car. CCTV and ANPR footage captured the Renault Capture travelling from Woolwich to Woodford Green and back again. The vehicle had been hired 2 days before the shooting by Stuart Ahern. When police finally recovered it, Kelly's fingerprints were found on the dashboard and passenger side door, but perhaps the most telling piece of evidence came later. In 2024, nearly 5 years after the attack, officers retrieved an iPad from the River Thames near the O2 Arena. Forensics experts managed to extract fragments of location data, even after it had been wiped. It had been used to track Paul Allen's Mercedes in the days leading up to the shooting. The digital trail was complete. Every breadcrumb led back to the same 3 men. While the attempted murder in Woodford Green dominated headlines in the UK, it was far from the only serious crime the trio had on their record. Just weeks before the shooting of Paul Allen, Daniel Kelly and the Ahern brothers were already on the radar of Swiss authorities for a separate high-value burglary, one that bore all the hallmarks of a professional, premeditated job. On the night of June 1st, 2019, the trio broke into the Museum of Far Eastern Arts in Geneva. Their entry was methodical. Wearing gloves, masks, and forehead lamps, they used an angle grinder, crowbar, and sledgehammer to force open the museum's doors. Once inside, they headed straight for a display labelled Room 3, home to some of the museum's most valuable artifacts. In under 5 minutes, they had smashed open display case 13 and escaped with 3 rare Ming Dynasty porcelain pieces: a delicate phoenix design bowl from the 14th century, a tiny chicken cup from the 15th, and a pomegranate-decorated bottle valued at nearly £2 million alone. In total, the haul was worth over £2.7 million, and just like that, they vanished. 2 weeks later, the group flew to Hong Kong in an attempt to sell the Phoenix Bowl at an auction house. But it was back in London where their plan began to unravel. In October 2020, Stuart Ahern was arrested during a sting operation at a central London hotel where he was trying to sell the stolen vase to an undercover police officer posing as a buyer. A subsequent search uncovered a fake passport in Stuart's name and a book on Ming Dynasty antiques, further tying them to the Geneva burglary. The Aherns were extradited to Switzerland, convicted of aggravated theft, and later returned to the UK to face far graver charges. By March 2025, nearly 6 years after Paul Allen was gunned down in his own kitchen, the full weight of the case was laid bare before a jury at the Old Bailey. It had taken years of forensic work, international cooperation, and painstaking investigation to reach this point. Now, the evidence, collected from gardens, devices, vehicles, and even riverbeds, was presented in sharp detail. Prosecutors wasted no time in dismantling the defendant's narrative. They walked the court through the planning stages. The tracking device planted on Allen's car, the hire car used for surveillance, the DNA found on a garden fence, the Glock handgun's spent casings, and the laser sight recovered from Kelly's home. Each thread of evidence tightened the noose. The defense tried to muddy the waters. They claimed coincidence. They questioned the reliability of the digital trail. At one point, Daniel Kelly insisted in a prepared statement that he held no grudge against Allen, claiming they'd known each other for over 2 decades and had always been on good terms. But the jury wasn't buying it. Friendship doesn't end in gunfire through a kitchen window. Paul Allen himself never took the stand. His injuries had changed his life irreversibly, but his silence didn't matter. The data, the footage, the fingerprints, those spoke louder than any testimony ever could. On 24th March 2025, the verdict was read out. All 3 men, Daniel Kelly, Stuart Ahern, and Louis Ahern, were found guilty of conspiracy to murder. As the decision was delivered, Stuart Ahern shouted at the jury, "You're only human. That's all I have to say about that." The courtroom fell silent. Justice had been delivered. But the impact of what had happened and how far the conspirators had gone would echo far beyond the verdict. This case was never just about one man being shot in his kitchen. It was about the lengths some will go to silence the past. It was about international art theft, digital surveillance, and violent retribution wrapped into a single web of criminality. The shooting exposed a layer of criminal enterprise most people associate with films, not real life. Ming Dynasty antiques, GPS trackers, hired getaway cars, gangsters posing as police officers to burgle high-end homes. And behind it all, 3 men from southeast London, each believing they were too smart to get caught. But they were wrong. Detectives didn't just respond to a shooting, they built a case that spanned years, borders, and disciplines. They worked with Swiss authorities, digital forensics teams, firearms analysts, and surveillance experts. They pulled an iPad from the bottom of a river and turned it into courtroom evidence. They found Kelly's fingerprints in a hire car returned weeks earlier. They put together a timeline so tight, it left the defense with nowhere to hide. Paul Allen survived, but his life was permanently altered. The man who once helped mastermind a £54 million robbery now moves through the world in a wheelchair, his past etched into every scar. And yet, justice was served, not just for him, but for a system too often outpaced by modern crime. Daniel Kelly, Stuart Ahern, Louis Ahern. Their days of plotting in the shadows are over. Sentencing is set for April 25th, and the only journeys they'll be taking now are between a cell and a courtroom. This wasn't just a failed hit, it was a reminder. that even in a world of encrypted apps, fake passports and international escapes, someone is always watching. And if the evidence doesn't get you, the river might still give up your secrets. Luton, a town no stranger to hardship, became the backdrop for one of the most brazen criminal plots in recent memory. In September 2023, 3 men launched a campaign of fear, determined to extort money from a man they believed had come into a life-changing inheritance. What started as a daylight kidnapping attempt quickly spiraled into a chilling campaign of threats and intimidation. When the abduction failed, the trio turned to arson, setting fire to the victim's fence and garden shed in a shocking display of escalation. The man and his family were left terrified, under constant watch, and unsure of how far the gang was willing to go. But behind the scenes, Bedfordshire police were closing in. Forensics, surveillance, and digital evidence would soon bring the case crashing down on the perpetrators. This is the story of how greed turned violent, and how a meticulous investigation brought 3 dangerous men to justice. The plot was ruthless, simple, and fueled by greed. 3 men, Dominic Croucher from Swansea and Jamie Williams and Paul Morell, both from Doncaster, came together with one clear objective: to extort a local man they believed had recently come into a significant amount of money. The target, known only as John Doe for legal protection, had led a quiet working-class life in Luton. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't involved in crime, but word had quietly spread that he'd inherited some money, possibly enough to buy a home outright. He told only a few people, but in tight-knit communities, whispers don't stay quiet for long. And when those whispers reached the wrong ears, the result was a plot that would spiral into violence and intimidation. By late August 2023, the conspirators had begun surveilling him. They tracked his movements, studied his routines, and mapped out the quiet moments in his day. They weren't local to Luton, but that didn't matter. Their planning was meticulous, their objective clear. They wanted money, and they were willing to abduct a man off the street to get it. The first move came on the evening of September 3rd. Just after 7:40 p.m, John Doe was walking down Havelock Road, a typical residential street. He had no idea that nearby, a white transit van sat waiting, fitted with cloned number plates and ready to vanish. Behind the wheel was Dominic Croucher, who had travelled from Swansea the previous day and stayed in a hotel overnight. On foot were Jamie Williams and another still unidentified man. The ambush was sudden. Williams and the other suspect approached quickly, grabbing the victim and dragging him to the ground. They tried to handcuff him and force him into the back of the van. It was broad daylight, and the street was far from empty, but they didn't care. The plan was built around speed and surprise, but what they hadn't counted on was resistance. John Doe fought back with everything he had. Kicking, shouting, and refusing to go quietly, he drew the attention of passers-by. One bystander intervened, shouting at the men and causing just enough panic to rattle them. Realizing their plan had failed, the attackers fled. The van roared away, and the suspects on foot disappeared into nearby streets. But in their haste, they made critical mistakes. The handcuffs used in the attack were dropped and left behind, seized by police that same night. The van, found abandoned not far from the scene, had false plates and signs of tampering. It was clear to detectives this was no random act. It was a premeditated kidnapping attempt. Soon, forensic testing on the handcuffs would return matches for both Jamie Williams and Paul Morell. That single piece of evidence would help crack open a conspiracy that had only just begun to unfold. For the victim, however, the nightmare was far from over. At first, he wondered if it had been mistaken identity. But deep down, he knew the truth. This was personal, and over the coming days, the harassment would only escalate, from failed abduction to psychological warfare. But while the gang believed they'd walked away with nothing more than a bruised ego, they had left behind the first piece of a trail. and Bedfordshire police were already starting to follow it. The failed kidnapping on Havelock Road should have marked the end of the plot, but for Dominic Croucher, Jamie Williams and Paul Morell, it was merely the beginning. Embarrassed by their botched attempt, and still determined to secure the life-changing money they believed the victim possessed, the trio chose a new weapon: fear. 8 days after the public abduction attempt, the campaign of intimidation began in earnest. The victim, still trying to process the assault, opened his phone to find something chilling. Direct messages sent via social media, filled with veiled threats and sinister undertones. But what set these apart were the images attached: photos of his home, his car, his family, taken from different angles at different times of day. These weren't random snaps, they were proof. Proof that he was being watched, closely, constantly. The psychological impact was devastating. Suddenly, everyday routines became riddled with paranoia. Was that person in the parked car watching him? Was that stranger at the corner there by chance, or by design, and the gang hadn't finished? On the night of September 11th, under cover of darkness, the intimidation escalated to outright terror. Williams and Morell travelled to the victim's property. Moving through side streets and back gardens, they reached the fence that bordered his home. With cold precision, they poured accelerant across the timber panels and onto the wooden garden shed. Then, with a flick of a lighter, they turned fear into flame. The fire spread rapidly. By the time emergency services arrived, the shed was engulfed and the fence was splintered and charred. The damage was more than material, it was psychological. The garden, once a space of calm and family life, had become a message board for terror. The victim and his loved ones didn't just fear another attack, they feared that next time the flames might reach their home. Police investigators, now fully aware of the gravity of the threats, began pulling together more evidence. Behind the scenes, a digital footprint was forming. The IP address used to send the social media messages led back to an address in Doncaster, Paul Morell's. The fire, the photos, the threats, they all began to link. But for the victim, the trauma was ongoing. He had survived a kidnapping attempt, was now the target of organised stalking, and had watched his property burn, all for money he never flaunted and never offered. The gang wanted to send a message: we're watching. We won't stop. But in doing so, they had unwittingly built a damning case. One photo, one flame, one message at a time. By mid-September 2023, what began as a single attempted abduction had spiraled into a campaign of fear, arson, and digital threats. Bedfordshire police recognised they weren't dealing with a one-off incident. They were confronting an organised and escalating criminal conspiracy. The moment the victim reported the arson attack, detectives launched a major investigation, treating the case with the urgency it now demanded. The first real breakthrough came from a seemingly simple oversight: the handcuffs. Abandoned in the chaos of the failed abduction, they were sent for forensic analysis. It didn't take long. DNA tests revealed a direct match to two of the suspects, Jamie Williams and Paul Morell. It was a clear link, placing them at the scene and, more importantly, tying them to an act of attempted kidnap. Suddenly, the investigation had a solid foundation, but police weren't stopping there. Using automatic number plate recognition, ANPR cameras across the region, they traced the movements of the white van used in the kidnapping attempt. That led them to Dominic Croucher. ANPR logs revealed the van had travelled from Swansea to Hemel Hempstead the night before the incident. CCTV from the hotel confirmed Croucher had stayed there, positioning him in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Even more damning was the convoy pattern uncovered by detectives. Alongside the white van, a rented white Mercedes was spotted, also bearing false plates. Rental records showed the vehicle had been booked by Paul Morell. The Mercedes was filmed travelling in convoy with the van on the night of the attack, further tightening the noose around the trio. When police raided the homes of the suspects, the evidence began to pile up. At Jamie Williams's property in Doncaster, officers found the replacement number plates used to disguise the van after the attempted kidnapping. Hidden nearby was something even more telling: the key to the same set of handcuffs left at the scene. Meanwhile, a search of Paul Morell's residence uncovered the final piece of the puzzle: a wireless router linked to the IP address used to send the threatening social media messages. Those threats, which included surveillance photos and chilling warnings, had now been digitally traced back to Morell's home. It was becoming impossible for any of the men to argue coincidence. The forensic digital and surveillance evidence all pointed in the same direction, and it was leading straight to Croucher, Williams, and Morell. Conversations between the trio, recovered from their phones, revealed discussions about the journey, what to say if stopped by police, and repeated references to life-changing money. Bedfordshire Police had built a case brick by brick, clue by clue. Now, with all three under suspicion and the evidence mounting, it was only a matter of time before the arrests came. The walls were closing in. After weeks of coordinated surveillance, forensic breakthroughs, and digital tracing, Bedfordshire Police made their move. On September 15, 2023, officers arrested Dominic Croucher and Jamie Williams in a series of early morning raids. Paul Morell, whose involvement had become increasingly evident through both physical and digital evidence, was taken into custody just 3 days later, on September 18th. The timing wasn't accidental. Investigators had waited until the full picture had formed, until every thread of the conspiracy had been tied back to the trio. Each suspect was brought in separately, questioned over the kidnapping attempt, the online threats, and the arson attack. Presented with a mountain of evidence, DNA matches, ANPR tracking data, CCTV footage, burner phone activity, and damning social media messages, they had little room to maneuver. Confronted by the reality of the case against them, all three men ultimately chose to plead guilty to charges of conspiracy to kidnap and conspiracy to blackmail. It was a turning point for the investigation, and a moment of vindication for a victim who had been through weeks of terror. Justice was delivered at Luton Crown Court in November 2024. The courtroom was packed, with officers, legal teams, and press all watching as the details of the plot were laid bare. Prosecutors described a calculated and sinister campaign, beginning with the failed street abduction and escalating into a targeted effort to mentally and physically break a man for the sake of money. The victim, whose identity was protected throughout, had endured weeks of stalking, threats, and violence. In a statement read to the court, he described the psychological toll of the ordeal, how fear had crept into every part of his daily life, forcing him to move from the community he once called home. Her Honour Judge Hunter K.C. made her position clear. She condemned the actions of the defendants in the strongest terms, calling them a deliberate, coordinated attempt to intimidate and extort through fear. She described the plan as organised criminal activity of the most disturbing kind, one that escalated in both danger and desperation as each stage failed to produce results. Dominic Croucher, 28, of Swansea, was sentenced to 8 years and 3 months in prison. Jamie Williams, 40, and Paul Morell, 39, both from Doncaster, and considered to have played more central roles in the plot, received 10 years and 6 months each. Their sentences reflected not only their involvement in the conspiracy, but the calculated nature of the crimes and the profound impact on their victim. For the officers involved, the successful prosecution marked the end of a complex and high-stakes investigation. For the victim, it meant closure, though the scars left behind would take far longer to heal. The impact of the conspiracy extended well beyond the immediate trauma suffered by the victim. It sent a chill through the wider Luton community, a stark reminder that even in quiet residential streets, danger can arrive without warning. The calculated and escalating nature of the crime made it all the more disturbing. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment offence. It was weeks of planning, surveillance and intimidation, carried out with cold precision by men determined to extort money by any means necessary. Detective Constable Daniel Matcham, who led the investigation, described the case as one of the most chilling he'd seen. He emphasized how the gang's violence and threats had left the victim not only in fear for his own life, but terrified for the safety of his family. It was a vendetta designed to wear a person down, to make them feel powerless, exposed, and watched at every turn. Although the victim escaped physical harm, the psychological toll was significant. His home, once a sanctuary, had become a source of fear. Online threats and real-world arson attacks blurred the line between harassment and real danger. In the end, he was forced to leave the area altogether, uprooting his life to protect those closest to him. But there was also strength. The community rallied and law enforcement acted quickly. The arrests and convictions were not only a triumph of policing, but a message that calculated violence and fear have no place on Luton's streets. The case of Croucher, Williams and Morell is a grim warning of how far greed can go, but also a testament to the resilience of a community and the justice that waits for those who believe they can act without consequence. In the criminal underworld of Manchester, betrayals can be just as deadly as rivalries. On a summer night in July 2022, Thomas Campbell, a well-connected drug dealer, was brutally ambushed and tortured in his own home. His murder was not a random act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated hit, executed by those he once trusted. Over 2 agonizing hours, Campbell suffered at the hands of his attackers, enduring a level of cruelty that shocked even hardened investigators. This is the story of how a web of deception, revenge, and organized crime led to one of the most shocking killings in recent Manchester history. Thomas Campbell was no ordinary victim. A convicted drug dealer with deep ties to organized crime, he was living a high-risk life, one that was always on the edge of violence. But in July 2022, that life came to a brutal end. Campbell was ambushed in his own home in Mossley, Tameside, in what police described as a robbery of a drug dealer by other drug dealers. However, this was no simple burglary. His attackers weren't just after money or drugs, they wanted to send a message. The plot to take down Campbell was months in the making. At the heart of it was his ex-wife, Colleen Campbell, who played a key role in setting him up. She had aligned herself with John Belfield, a known figure in Manchester's criminal underworld, who had his own vendetta against Campbell. Their connection was more than coincidental. Belfield had been obsessively tracking Campbell after he had begun dating Belfield's ex-girlfriend. Seeking revenge, he worked with Colleen to gather intelligence on Campbell's daily routine, phone activity, and most importantly, his whereabouts. But Belfield and his associates didn't leave anything to chance. A GPS tracking device was planted on Campbell's van, allowing them to follow his every move with precision. They had already attempted the attack once before, but called it off when Campbell unexpectedly took his dog for a walk instead of entering his house. This time, there was no such delay. John Belfield was no ordinary figure in Manchester's criminal underworld. At just 28 years old, he had established himself as a violent and ruthless player in the drug trade, someone whose reputation alone was enough to instill fear. But for Belfield, Thomas Campbell wasn't just another business rival. This wasn't about territory or money. This was personal. Campbell had started a relationship with Belfield's ex-girlfriend, and in his eyes, that was an unforgivable betrayal. Belfield wasn't interested in a petty confrontation. He wanted complete destruction. But to ensure Campbell's downfall, he needed someone on the inside, someone with unrestricted access to his target's life. That's where Colleen Campbell, Thomas's ex-wife, became a crucial part of the plot. Over several weeks, she fed Belfield a steady stream of intelligence, where Thomas lived, when he was home, what car he drove, and even the precise details of his daily routine. She made sure that when the time came, there would be no mistakes. But second-hand information wasn't enough. Belfield wanted real-time tracking. A GPS device was secretly planted on Campbell's van, allowing him and his associates to follow his every movement with pinpoint accuracy. This level of surveillance was usually seen in law enforcement operations, but in the world of organized crime, Belfield was taking no chances. He wanted Campbell completely vulnerable. As the attack drew closer, Colleen and Belfield exchanged dozens of messages, carefully coordinating their next move. She reassured him that Campbell was exactly where he needed to be, unknowingly sealing her ex-husband's fate. Then, the night before the murder, Belfield sent a chilling one-word message. Tomorrow. It was the final confirmation. The plan was in motion and there was no turning back. To carry out the attack, Belfield recruited Rhys Stephen and Stephen Cleworth, two men with violent pasts and no hesitation about getting their hands dirty. Though Cleworth was absent on the night of the murder, lost in a drug-fueled binge at a swingers club, his role in planning the ambush was undeniable. The trap was set. Thomas Campbell, completely unaware of the betrayal unfolding around him, was walking straight into his execution. On the night of July 2nd, 2022, Thomas Campbell returned to his home in Mossley, Tameside, completely unaware that his fate had already been sealed. In the darkness, 3 armed men waited, ready to strike. They had attempted the ambush once before, but aborted when Campbell unexpectedly took his dog for a walk instead of heading straight inside. This time, there would be no mistakes. As Campbell reached his front door, the attackers pounced. The ambush was immediate and ruthless. Campbell fought back with everything he had, resisting for nearly 40 seconds, throwing punches and struggling to break free. But the odds were against him. Outnumbered and overpowered, he was dragged inside. From that moment, the true nightmare began. What followed was 2 hours of relentless brutality. Campbell was tied up, beaten mercilessly and stabbed multiple times. His attackers ransacked his home, tearing through every room in search of cash, drugs, or anything of value. But this wasn't just about robbery, this was about inflicting pain. The level of violence went far beyond what was necessary to subdue him. In one of the most horrific acts of torture, the attackers poured boiling water over his body, leaving agonizing burns that compounded his already gruesome injuries. In total, Campbell suffered at least 61 separate wounds. In a final desperate attempt to survive, Campbell somehow managed to dial 999, but by then his strength was gone. The emergency operator's voice rang out, "Fire? Police? Or ambulance? If you can't speak, tap the handset, cough, or make a noise." Silence. His body had endured too much. His killers showed no mercy, continuing their assault before finally deciding they had done enough. When they fled into the night, they left Campbell behind, alone and broken. His body lay in the hallway, ankles bound with duct tape, naked except for a pair of socks. Hours would pass before anyone would discover the horrors that had unfolded inside that house. By then, it was far too late. The following morning, a neighbor noticed Thomas Campbell's front door ajar. Concerned, they approached the house and stepped inside, only to be met with a gruesome and chilling sight. Campbell's lifeless body lay sprawled in the hallway, his ankles bound with duct tape. His battered and burned skin told the horrific story of the torture he had endured. Blood was splattered across the walls and floor, clear evidence of the brutal 2-hour assault that had taken place within the home. It was a crime scene so disturbing that even seasoned detectives would later describe it as one of the most harrowing they had encountered. Greater Manchester Police quickly arrived, sealing off the area and launching a full-scale murder investigation. Crime scene analysts meticulously examined every inch of the property. quickly realizing that this was not a random attack. The house had been wiped down in an attempt to erase forensic evidence, indicating that the killers had planned ahead, taking careful steps to cover their tracks. However, no crime is ever completely perfect. Despite their efforts, the attackers had overlooked key pieces of evidence, crucial details that would eventually expose them. Detectives began reconstructing Campbell's final hours, tracing his movements, contacts, and recent interactions. What they uncovered was a web of deceit and betrayal far deeper than they had initially suspected. His ex-wife, Colleen Campbell, had played a significant role in setting him up. She had been in frequent contact with John Belfield, a known criminal with a personal vendetta against Thomas. As investigators followed the trail of phone records, CCTV footage, and forensic clues, they discovered the carefully orchestrated plan that had led to Campbell's murder. The discovery of Campbell's body marked the beginning of an intense police investigation, one that would unravel a sinister plot driven by revenge, jealousy, and greed. The men who had so meticulously planned his death had made one crucial mistake. They had left behind just enough evidence for the police to piece together the truth. And now, the hunt for justice had begun. As detectives dug into Thomas Campbell's final days, a disturbing pattern of events began to emerge. Police traced his movements leading up to the attack, uncovering a carefully orchestrated plot. CCTV footage captured a critical moment just 2 hours before the murder. Colleen Campbell, his ex-wife, engaged in a phone call with John Belfield, the man believed to be the mastermind behind the attack. Phone records revealed an extensive exchange between the two in the days leading up to the killing, further solidifying their connection. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the GPS tracking device found on Campbell's van. This device had allowed the killers to monitor his every move in real time, ensuring they knew exactly when to strike. Investigators soon determined that the attack was not a random act of violence, but a calculated execution carried out with precision. As police identified suspects, Rhys Stephen quickly emerged as one of the key attackers. His criminal history painted a clear picture. He had 18 prior convictions, including robbery and possession of an imitation firearm. When confronted, he attempted to minimize his role, claiming he was merely a participant rather than a ringleader. However, forensic evidence and phone data placed him at the center of the attack, making his involvement undeniable. Another critical figure in the plot was Stephen Cleworth. While he was not physically present at the scene, he had played a crucial role in orchestrating the attack. On the night of the murder, Cleworth had been on a drug-fueled binge at a swingers club, seemingly uninvolved. However, surveillance footage from days before showed him meeting with Belfield and Stephen, actively planning the attack. His absence from the crime scene did not absolve him of responsibility. His role in the setup was clear. Finally, there was Colleen Campbell, the woman who had set everything into motion. While she never laid a hand on her ex-husband, her betrayal was instrumental in his death. By providing critical intelligence, including his whereabouts and daily routine, she had made the attack possible. Investigators had built a damning case against her, proving she had conspired with Belfield to ensure Thomas Campbell was left vulnerable to his attackers. With overwhelming evidence stacking up, police prepared to bring the perpetrators to justice. The web of deception was beginning to unravel, and the truth behind Thomas Campbell's brutal murder was finally coming to light. In February 2023, the trial of those responsible for Thomas Campbell's murder began at Bolton Crown Court. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case, meticulously detailing the calculated ambush, the extensive planning that led up to it, and the roles each conspirator had played. With witness testimony, CCTV footage, phone records, and forensic evidence stacked against them, there was little doubt about their guilt. Reece Stephen, the man who physically carried out the attack, was found guilty of murder and conspiracy to rob. His violent criminal history, combined with the sheer brutality of Campbell's torture and death, made it impossible for the jury to show leniency. The judge handed him a life sentence, ordering him to serve a minimum of 37 years before any possibility of release. Stephen Cleworth, though not present at the crime scene, was convicted of manslaughter. His involvement in the planning stages was undeniable. He had met with John Belfield and Reece Stephen, helped coordinate the attack, and played a vital role in ensuring Campbell was vulnerable at the time of the assault. Despite missing the actual killing due to a drug-fueled binge at a swingers club, his part in the conspiracy was enough to earn him a life sentence with a minimum of 12 years before parole eligibility. Colleen Campbell, who maintained throughout the trial that she had no knowledge of what would happen to her ex-husband, was also convicted of manslaughter. The jury did not believe her claims of innocence. Her role in the attack was clear. She had fed Belfield key intelligence about Thomas's whereabouts, his home, and his routines, ensuring that his killers struck at the perfect moment. For her betrayal, she was sentenced to 13 years behind bars. However, the man believed to have masterminded the entire plot, John Belfield, was nowhere to be found. By the time police moved in to arrest him, he had already disappeared. Now, he remains one of Britain's most wanted fugitives, accused of orchestrating one of Manchester's most calculated and chilling murders. His capture is inevitable, but until then, justice for Thomas Campbell remains incomplete. The murder of Thomas Campbell sent shockwaves through Manchester's criminal underworld, exposing the violent rivalries and betrayals that define organised crime. His execution-style killing was not just a robbery gone wrong, it was a deliberate act of vengeance, carried out with ruthless precision. The brutality of his final hours left even hardened investigators appalled, reinforcing just how dangerous the world Campbell operated in had become. For Campbell's family, the pain was unbearable. His father, devastated by the horrifying details of his son's death, described the crime as not the act of animals, but of creatures, saying, "Every morning I wake up, the first thing I think about is him, alone in that house with those people. The pain will never leave us." His words reflected the immense grief and suffering left in the wake of Campbell's murder. The knowledge of what he endured, 2 hours of relentless torture, was a burden they would carry forever. Despite his criminal past, nothing could justify the sheer level of violence inflicted upon him. This was not a mere dispute or a robbery. It was a calculated, sadistic execution designed to send a message. The methodical planning, the tracking device, and the brutal torture all pointed to a crime driven by more than just money. It was about power, control, and revenge. While several of Campbell's killers were brought to justice, the alleged mastermind behind it all, John Belfield, remains on the run. An international warrant has been issued for his arrest, and law enforcement continues its relentless pursuit. But as history has shown, no fugitive can evade capture forever. The net is closing in, and when he is finally caught, he will have to answer for his role in one of Manchester's most shocking and brutal murders. Bristol, January 27, 2024. A bitterly cold Saturday night. On the streets of Knowle West, 2 teenage boys were out doing what teenagers do, kicking about, catching up, enjoying a bit of freedom. Max Dixon was 16, Mason Wrist was 15, best mates, inseparable. They weren't looking for trouble. They had no idea it was about to find them. Moments later, a grey Audi pulled up. 4 masked teenagers leapt out, armed with knives and machetes. What followed was fast and feral. Max and Mason were chased down and stabbed repeatedly on the pavement. The attackers fled, and 2 boys were left bleeding out in the dark. Despite the best efforts of emergency crews, neither of them made it. Max and Mason died in hospital. 2 lives lost, 2 families broken, and a city left stunned by the sheer savagery of what had just happened. But this wasn't random. It was a revenge hit, part of a violent feud between 2 areas of Bristol, Hartcliffe and Knowle West. The killers had come looking for payback after a rival gang attacked a home linked to their side, but they got it wrong. Max and Mason weren't involved, they were just there, in the way. Over the next 11 months, detectives would piece together what really happened that night. A planned ride out, a car packed with weapons, a group of teenagers led by an older boy with a score to settle, and a getaway driver old enough to be their dad. The motive was simple, vengeance, but the result was anything but. This is the story of a brutal mistake, of a gang out for blood, and 2 boys who never saw it coming. A case that shocked Bristol and showed just how far postcode violence can reach. At the centre of this ride out was Riley Tower, just 18 years old but already deep in the world of postcode violence. Born and raised in Weston-super-Mare, Tower wasn't from Bristol, but he had ties to Hartcliffe and carried himself like someone with something to prove. In the eyes of police, he wasn't just part of the problem, he was the one pulling the strings. It was Tower who gathered the group. Teenagers aged 15, 16 and 17, each of them still in school, still technically children, but drawn into something far more dangerous. He rallied them in the days after an earlier attack, an incident involving damage to a house connected to their group. Police believe it was a warning shot from rivals in Knowle West. For Tower, it was personal, and he wanted payback. But this wasn't rage in the heat of the moment. It was planned, calculated. On the night of January 27th, Tower got into a grey Audi Q2 driven by Anthony Snook, a 45-year-old man with a long criminal record and zero regard for the fact he was about to chauffeur a group of kids to commit murder. Tower wasn't just along for the ride. He was the one leading the charge, egging the others on, steering the mood. Prosecutors would later describe the group as a pack of wolves, and Tower was at the front. This was about reputation, about showing force, about making sure the other side knew they couldn't be touched without consequences. But what makes this case even harder to stomach is how wrong they got it. Tower and the others thought they'd spotted someone linked to the earlier attack. Instead, they found Max and Mason. It didn't matter. They fit the profile, same area, same look, wrong place. That was enough. On that night in January, Riley Tower made a decision to turn a petty feud into a killing. And it was a decision that would ruin lives, including his own. The Audi moved slowly through the quiet streets of Knowle West. Inside the car, 5 people sat with a single purpose. Riley Tower, already hardened, watched from the front passenger seat. Beside him, Anthony Snook, a criminal who should have known better, kept the engine steady. In the back were 3 teenage boys, younger still, each masked, each holding a weapon. They weren't sightseeing. This was a ride out, preparation for a revenge attack after a house linked to their group in Hartcliffe had been targeted. That earlier incident hadn't left anyone dead. This one would. They didn't have a name, or a face, or a real target. Just a direction, a location, a desire to hurt someone, anyone they believed was connected to the other side of the postcode war. It didn't matter who it was, as long as they were from Knowle West. That was enough. As they drove down Ilminster Avenue, the car slowed. 2 boys were walking up ahead, hoods up, heads down, side by side. 16-year-old Max Dixon, 15-year-old Mason Wrist. They had nothing to do with the feud, no weapons, no threats, no links to gangs, just 2 friends out on a Saturday night. The Audi passed them once, then looped around. CCTV would later capture what happened next. The car swung back towards the boys, slowing just enough. Doors burst open. 4 teenagers jumped out and ran. There was no conversation, no warning, only violence. Max and Mason tried to run. They didn't get far. One was chased onto a driveway, the other pinned down near a parked car. What followed was fast, frenzied, and brutal. They were stabbed again and again, each wound more savage than the last. There was no pause, no sign of mercy. The attackers struck with precision as though they'd done it before. Then, just as quickly, they were gone. Back in the car, disappearing into the night. People nearby heard the screaming. Neighbors ran outside. Calls to 999 flooded in. Police arrived within 60 seconds. Paramedics followed close behind, but it wasn't enough. Max died in the street. Mason held on a little longer, but the injuries were too severe. He died in hospital not long after. 2 lives ended for nothing. The knives used were large, some described as machete-sized. These weren't pocket blades or weapons grabbed in the heat of the moment. They had been brought for this. Every one of the teenagers had come prepared to kill. Later in court, the prosecution described it as a pack attack, a planned act of violence, and although none of the victims were the intended target, that didn't seem to matter to those responsible. They came to cause harm, and they didn't leave disappointed. But what they left behind was irreversible. In the hours after the attack, Bristol's streets were tense. Police cordoned off Ilminster Avenue. Crime scene tape stretched across pavements, where blood still marked the spot Max and Mason had fallen. Officers combed the area through the night, but while the streets were quiet behind the scenes, the work was just beginning. The case was immediately handed to Avon and Somerset Police's major crime investigation team. It was clear from the outset this wasn't going to be a quick win. The suspects had vanished without a trace, wearing masks, armed and silent. There was no known link between the victims and the attackers. This wasn't gang on gang, this was a mistake. That made it harder and more urgent. The breakthrough came from the city's surveillance network. Bristol is one of the most heavily monitored urban areas in the UK, and detectives used that to their advantage. Dozens of hours of CCTV footage were pulled and reviewed. From there, investigators began tracing the vehicle's movements in reverse. The car was tracked across neighbourhoods, seen picking up individuals earlier in the night. Eventually, it led them to Anthony Snook, the registered driver, the man with a criminal past, now caught on camera driving 4 armed teenagers to the scene of a double murder. Snook's arrest gave police the first piece of the puzzle, but he wasn't talking.
Mr. Snook, can you just listen to my colleague a minute? Is that okay?
Hello. So the circumstances have now changed, so I'll be placing you under arrest for murder, 1 count of murder. So you don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence, okay? So the circumstances are still the same. Your vehicle was linked to where the stabbing has taken place, and subsequently someone has been murdered, all right? So the necessities are for prompt and effective investigation, protect vulnerable person, protect from further offences, all right? Okay?
We're just going to carry on to custody now,
Yeah,
okay?
we'll carry on to custody.
The forensic work began next. Officers found DNA evidence on the inside of the car. Blood traces, fibres, glove prints. Clothing discarded nearby was later recovered, linking back to several suspects. Social media was also monitored. Within days, posts and messages began to surface, not from the attackers directly, but from the wider circle, people hinting at what had happened, others bragging, some just trying to make sense of it all. Word was spreading fast. But so was the police net. One by one, the suspects were identified. The youngest was just 15, the others 16 and 17. All had prior contact with youth services. Some were already on the police radar. Their names couldn't be published at first, protected by law due to their age. But inside interrogation rooms, detectives began to link them to the scene. Some denied everything. One stayed silent. Another confessed. It was painstaking work. 11 months of cross-department coordination, involving neighbourhood policing teams, forensics, drone surveillance and firearms units on standby. Each suspect was tracked, matched to evidence and eventually charged. At every stage, Max and Mason's families were kept informed. They sat through interviews, case updates, and later court hearings, waiting to hear how 2 boys with no part in any feud had ended up the victims of one of Bristol's most devastating street attacks in recent memory. The investigation didn't just uncover what happened. It revealed how far some were willing to go for revenge and how quickly the wrong people can pay the ultimate price. The arrests came in waves. Once police had the names, they moved quickly. Avon and Somerset's major crime unit launched a coordinated operation to bring every suspect in, fast, hard, and without warning. This wasn't just about knocking on doors. These were violent offenders, some believed to still be carrying weapons. Armed officers were deployed. The drone unit was called in to watch from above. Surveillance teams tracked movement around estates in Hartcliffe and Weston-super-Mare. And then, in the early hours, they moved. Anthony Snook was first. He was arrested at his home in Hartcliffe, caught completely off guard. He didn't resist. When officers told him he was being arrested for murder, he didn't say a word. It was a quiet moment that carried the full weight of what he was facing. A man in his 40s, twice the age of the others, now accused of helping children carry out a double killing. The teenagers were picked up shortly after. One was arrested at home, another found hiding at a relative's address. The 15-year-old, the youngest of them all, was taken into custody while his parents looked on, stunned. The group didn't fight the arrests. No car chases, no last stands, just silence.
That was right? Yeah. So, intelligence has received naming you, along with others, as being responsible for the murders of Max Dixon and Mason Rist on Saturday, 27th of January 2014 at around 2300.
Okay, at the moment, you're under arrest on suspicion of murder. You don't have to say anything. It may harm your defence. You don't mention one question second later on in court. Anything you do say may be given evidence.
But what followed sent shockwaves through the city. When the details were released, the reaction was instant, not just to the brutality of the attack, but to the ages of those responsible. Teenagers, children by legal definition. Armed with machetes, moving like seasoned criminals, carrying out an execution-style assault on the wrong people. Even seasoned officers said they were shaken by how casually it had been planned and carried out. Searches of their homes turned up more. Clothes matching CCTV, burner phones, messages, incriminating conversations that helped cement timelines. Some of the teenagers had even changed outfits after the attack, discarding evidence in bins and alleyways. But not everything had been cleaned up, and with each piece recovered, the case became clearer. In interview rooms, the suspects reacted in different ways. The 15-year-old eventually pleaded guilty to one of the murders. The others offered half-truths, denials, or silence, but the forensic trail was already there. The CCTV, the phone data, the shared responsibility. In the eyes of the law, they were all part of the same plan, and that plan had ended in 2 deaths. For Max and Mason's families, the takedown brought little relief. Nothing would bring the boys back. But seeing the suspects named, charged, and remanded offered something else. The beginning of justice. The city, still reeling, now watched as 5 suspects faced trial for one of Bristol's darkest nights. 2 innocent boys were dead. But the people responsible were finally behind bars awaiting their fate. When the verdicts came in, the courtroom fell silent. The families of Max Dixon and Mason Rist, who had sat through every grim detail, every frame of CCTV, every expert witness, finally had an answer. Guilty, all of them. Riley Tower, 18 years old, convicted of both murders. He'd led the attack, armed the group, and orchestrated the ride-out that ended in 2 deaths. The jury saw through his defense with ease. He was no passenger. He was the driving force. The 15-year-old, the youngest of the group, had already pleaded guilty. The others, aged 16 and 17, were found guilty by majority verdicts after lengthy deliberation. All 3 were named publicly once the trial ended. Childhood anonymity stripped away. Then there was Anthony Snook. At 45, He'd acted as the enabler, the adult in the car, the man trusted with a license and a vehicle, who instead became the driver for a murder team. He claimed he didn't know what was going to happen, but the evidence said otherwise. He circled the streets. He waited while they attacked. He drove them away. 2 counts of murder, guilty on both. At sentencing, the judge didn't hold back.
The CCTV capturing their brutal cutting down by these defendants is shocking and distressing viewing.
Each of the teenagers was handed a life sentence. Because of their age, the minimum terms varied. The 15-year-old, who admitted his role early on, received a shorter minimum, but still over a decade. The others were told they would serve at least 16, 17, and in Tor's case, 18 years before even being considered for release. Snook was also jailed for life. His minimum term, 28 years. By the time he's eligible for parole, he'll be in his 70s. On paper, it sounds like justice. 5 people convicted and locked away. But for Max and Mason's families, those numbers mean little. What is a life sentence to a mother who will never see her son again? What does 18 years mean when your child died before reaching adulthood? Compared to other recent UK murder cases involving youth gangs and postcode violence, the sentences are consistent. In the case of Keon Lincoln, a 15-year-old boy stabbed and shot to death in Birmingham, multiple teenagers received life with similar minimum terms. The courts have drawn a hard line when it comes to group attacks, especially those involving premeditation, weapons, and innocent victims. The message is clear. If you join in, you're responsible for everything that happens. Still, it's hard not to feel the weight of what's been lost. 5 boys now face much of their lives behind bars. One man has thrown away his future and whatever was left of his reputation. But none of it brings back Max and Mason. None of it restores the families broken by a 10-second attack carried out on a cold street for no reason at all. Justice was served by the letter of the law. But outside the courtroom, nothing about this feels balanced. 2 boys are gone. And nothing about that is fair.